The year is 1945. While the rest of the world celebrates the end of a nightmare, a different kind of darkness is brewing in the Austrian Alps. Far away from the surrendering armies and the burning documents of Berlin, a lone military vehicle struggles through a blinding snowstorm near the Grossglockner Peak. Inside is Colonel Friedrich Kraus, a man whose name was missing from every official prisoner list and every casualty report. Kraus was not a frontline soldier. He was a specialist in ancient acquisitions, a man tasked with finding places where things could stay hidden for an eternity. Witnesses from a nearby village, the last people to see him alive, described a man who looked possessed. He didn't ask for shelter. He asked for the precise coordinates of a cave known locally as the Mouth of Ice, a place the villagers avoided even in the height of summer. Kraus climbed into the frozen wilderness, carrying nothing but a heavy leather satchel and a wooden crate marked with a red seal. He never came back down. For 80 years, the mountain kept his secret. Search parties, historians, and even intelligence agencies tried to track his path, but the Mouth of Ice seemed to have swallowed him whole. Fast forward to the present day. Global temperatures are rising, and the ancient glaciers of the Alps are retreating at an unprecedented rate. What was once buried under 50 feet of solid ice is now being exposed to the modern sun. In early 2026, a high-altitude climate research drone, equipped with experimental LiDAR sensors designed to see through ice, picked up a geometric anomaly. It wasn't a natural rock formation. It was a perfect rectangle, carved directly into the granite face of a cliff that had been frozen shut since the mid-1940s. When the recovery team reached the site, they found that the ice had partially melted, revealing the entrance to a cave that shouldn't have existed. The air that rushed out of the opening was stagnant, smelling of old iron and ozone, a scent that hadn't changed in 8 decades. As they stepped inside, their flashlights cut through the gloom, reflecting off walls that were lined with a thin layer of frost. This was the threshold of Colonel Kraus's final mission. In the center of the first chamber, sitting perfectly preserved on a natural stone pedestal, was the leather satchel. It looked as if it had been placed there yesterday. The leather was stiff from the cold, but intact. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a diary. Its cover was embossed with a symbol that made the lead researcher's blood run cold, a specialized unit insignia that had been officially disbanded years before the war even ended. This diary wasn't a record of military victories. As they flipped to the first page, they saw a map. But it wasn't a map of the Alps. It was a star chart, with lines drawn between constellations and specific geographic points across the globe. Below the chart, in Kraus's jagged, frantic handwriting, were the words, "The ice is not a grave. It is a nursery." If they find this before the signal, the silence was in vain. The team realized that Kraus hadn't died in a desperate attempt to hide. He had been a guardian. And as their flashlights moved further into the cave, they saw the shadow of something much larger, a wooden crate with a broken red seal. The crate was empty. Something that Kraus had brought into this cave 80 years ago was no longer inside its box. It was somewhere deeper in the mountain, and for the first time in nearly a century, it was no longer alone in the dark. The emptiness of the wooden crate sent a chill through the team that had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperatures. Colonel Kraus had entered this cave with a heavy burden, but the ancient acquisition he was tasked to protect was gone. Dr. Eris Thorne, the lead investigator, knelt by the empty box. The red seal hadn't been broken by force from the outside. The wood was splintered outward, as if something, or someone, had forced its way out of the crate while it was still inside the frozen vault. The diary mentions a signal, Thorne whispered, his breath clouding in the beam of his headlamp. If the ice was a nursery, Then what exactly was Kraus raising in here? As they moved deeper into the cavern, the natural limestone gave way to something far more deliberate. The walls were now lined with a peculiar, dark alloy, a metal that felt warm to the touch despite being encased in a glacier for 80 years. This was the Project Eisen-Himmel, Iron Heaven, technology, rumored in the darkest corners of intelligence archives, but never before proven to exist. This metal wasn't just structural, it was humming. A low-frequency vibration that resonated in the explorer's teeth, a sound that the drone's sensors had mistaken for tectonic activity. They reached a second chamber, a massive dome carved with surgical precision. In the center stood a desk, perfectly preserved by the dry, frozen air. On it sat a Leica camera, a half-empty bottle of schnapps, and a series of technical drawings that defied 1940s physics. The drawings depicted a resonance transmitter, a device designed to send a signal through the Earth's crust rather than through the air. Kraus wasn't trying to talk to the world. He was trying to wake it up. Thorne turned the pages of the cryptic diary to the entries from June 1945, weeks after the war was officially over. "The world believes the silence is peace," Kraus had written. "They do not realize that we have simply moved the pieces under the board. The acquisition is stable. It feeds on the mountain's thermal energy. I can hear it breathing through the vents. It is not a weapon of war, but a weapon of time. When the ice thins, the broadcast begins." The team's tech specialist, scanning the walls with a handheld magnetometer, suddenly gasped. "Dr. Thorne, look at the floor. The metal isn't just on the walls, it's a circuit." Following the lines of the dark alloy, they saw that the entire floor of the dome was a massive, circular antenna. In the very center, where the lines converged, was a small, hexagonal pedestal. Resting on it was a device that looked like a precursor to a modern microprocessor, but built with vacuum tubes and gold-spun wire. It was glowing with a faint, pulsing violet light. Suddenly, the low-frequency hum intensified. The violet light on the pedestal began to flash in a rhythmic sequence. It was a number station code, but one that was being broadcast directly into the mountain's bedrock. This was the signal Kraus had died to protect. But who was the recipient? As the team recorded the sequence, they heard a sound that didn't belong in a tomb, a heavy, mechanical hiss. At the far end of the chamber, a pressurized door, one that had been sealed since 1945, slowly began to rotate. The mouth of ice was no longer just a cave. It was an active transmitter. Beyond the door lay a third chamber, but as their lights swept the room, they didn't find machines. They found a row of sleeping quarters. 6 bunks, all neatly made. 5 of them were empty. In the 6th bunk, a figure lay under a thick wool blanket. Thorne stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. He pulled back the edge of the blanket. It wasn't the colonel. It was a young man, barely 20, looking as if he had just fallen asleep an hour ago. Beside him sat a modern digital watch, its screen flickering with the date, February 23rd, 2026. The realization hit them like a physical blow. Kraus hadn't just hidden a diary or a machine. He had hidden a legacy. This was one of the children of the signal, a sleeper agent kept in stasis by the very technology the team had just accidentally fully powered. Above them, the mountain groaned. The retreating ice had triggered more than just a discovery. It had completed a circuit. Outside the cave, hidden sensors in the valley began to broadcast their own response. The 80 years of silence were over. The signal had been received. The sterile blue light of the research team's tactical torches washed over the figure in the 6th bunk. Unlike the mummified remains usually found in Alpine caves, this young man looked vibrant. His skin wasn't the gray parchment of the dead. It was pale, yes, but supple. Dr. Thorne leaned closer, his medical training taking over his sense of dread. He checked the pulse at the neck. It was there, one beat every 60 seconds. A metabolic rate so slow it was practically invisible to anything but the most precise sensors. He's in deep stasis, Thorne whispered, his voice cracking. Cryogenic preservation, but without the ice. This dark alloy on the walls, it's not just humming. It's a field. It's keeping him suspended in time. The tech specialist, still focused on the glowing pedestal in the center of the dome, called out. Dr. Thorne, the digital watch. It's not just a watch. It's a receiver. Beside the sleeping man, the flickering screen of the 2026 watch wasn't showing the time anymore. It was scrolling through a list of encrypted authentication codes, codes that were being fed to it by the resonance transmitter in the previous room. The signal Kraus had protected wasn't just a message to the outside world. It was a wake-up call for the children of the signal. Thorne picked up the diary again, turning to the final, frantic pages. The handwriting had become almost illegible, the ink smudged as if by tears or melting frost. August 1945. The others are asleep. I'm the last one standing watch. The Eisen-Himmel alloy is hungry. It requires the mountain's core heat to maintain the field. I have bypassed the thermal vents. They will sleep for a decade, maybe two. I have left the ledger in the wooden crate near the mouth. If the world finds its way back to sanity, let them wake the boys. If not, let the ice be their shield. The crate. Thorne realized, looking back toward the entrance. The red seal wasn't broken by something coming out. It was broken by someone going in recently. The team's magnetometer began to scream. A massive surge of electromagnetic energy was building up beneath their feet. The violet light in the room turned a blinding, sharp white. On the walls, the dark alloy began to glow red-hot. The nursery was no longer just maintaining life. It was initiating the unfreezing protocol. Suddenly, the young man's eyes flew open. They weren't the eyes of a confused 20-year-old. They were clouded with a milky, iridescent film, a side effect of 80 years of resonance exposure. He didn't gasp or struggle. He simply sat up, his movements fluid and mechanical, as if he were a machine being switched on after a long hiatus. He looked directly at Dr. Thorne. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Instead, the resonance transmitter in the next room boomed with a synthesized voice, translated through the very metal of the mountain. Identification confirmed. Source: 2026 satellite uplink. Status: the world is ready. Initiate Phase 2. Outside, the mountain let out a deafening crack. A massive slab of the Grossglockner Glacier, weakened by the internal heat of the bunker, slid down the slope, exposing the full entrance of the mouth of ice to the valley below. But it wasn't just researchers watching now. On the team's radio, a new frequency broke through, not the cult-like voice of the SS, but a crisp, modern military command. All units, this is Overwatch. The Alpine anomaly has reached 100% power. The signal is being broadcast globally. Engage the containment protocol. No witnesses. The team realized with a jolt of terror, they weren't just discovering history. They were caught in the crossfire of a war that had been waiting 80 years for the ice to melt. And the young man in the room was only the first of 5 who were about to wake up. The air in the chamber crackled with static as the Overwatch command echoed through the research team's radios. The containment protocol had been triggered. Outside, the distant thrum of rotors began to vibrate through the mountain. Black, unmarked helicopters were closing in on the Grossglockner Ridge. But inside the cave, the situation was far more immediate. The young man with the iridescent eyes, the first of the children of the signal, was no longer sitting on his bunk. He moved with a terrifying, pre-programmed speed, his fingers dancing across a hidden panel in the dark alloy wall. As he touched the metal, sections of the rock face hissed open, revealing a hidden arsenal. These weren't 1940s rifles. They were advanced, coil-driven weapons that looked like they had been designed by a physicist rather than a gunsmith. "He's not a soldier," Dr. Thorne whispered, backing his team toward the exit. "He's a biological key." Suddenly, the young man spoke. His voice didn't come from his throat, but from the speakers of the resonance transmitter, booming with a chilling, calm authority. "You are intruders in a sanctuary of time. The Colonel's diary told you to wake us only if the world was sane. Your overwatch proves that the world is still hungry for the shadow. We are the deterrent." He turned toward the other 5 bunks. The white light in the room shifted to a deep, pulsating amber. The other sleepers began to stir. Their chests rose in unison, a synchronized revival that made the mountain's low-frequency hum escalate into a deafening roar. "We have to get out now," the tech specialist screamed. But as they turned to flee back through the metallic-lined tunnel, the pressurized door they had entered through slammed shut with the force of a hydraulic press. They were trapped between the awakening children and the advancing Overwatch team. Thorne lunged for the Colonel's diary, which had fallen to the floor. He flipped to the very last page, a page he hadn't seen before because it was stuck together with a thin layer of wax. He peeled it back. "Note to the unintended. If the containment team arrives before the boys are fully conscious, use the mercury override located beneath the map table. It will flood the mountain with a counter-frequency. It will put them back to sleep, but it will also erase the signal forever. Choose the truth of the past or the safety of the future." Through the thick, metallic door, the team heard the first muffled explosions. Overwatch wasn't waiting for an invitation. They were using thermal charges to breach the mouth of ice. The mountain groaned under the assault. The first child looked at Thorne, his milky eyes narrowing. He raised the coil-driven weapon, but he didn't point it at the researchers. He pointed it at the ceiling. "The mercury override is a lie told by a dying man who lost his faith," the voice from the transmitter said. "The Colonel didn't want us to sleep. He wanted us to wait for the satellite era. Look at your devices. The signal isn't just a broadcast. It's a virus." Thorne looked at his tablet. The screen was a chaotic mess of scrolling data. The resonance transmitter was using the research team's own uplink to bridge the gap between 1945 and 2026. The shadow ledger, the list of every sleeper agent and hidden asset across the globe, was being uploaded to the cloud at lightning speed. Suddenly, the main door buckled. A blinding flash of white light filled the tunnel as an Overwatch breach charge detonated. Figures in high-tech tactical gear, wearing gas masks with red lenses, swarmed into the chamber. Flashbang, one of the researchers yelled, but the child of the signal didn't flinch. He fired the coil weapon. There was no bang, only a localized ripple in the air. The Overwatch soldiers were thrown backward as if struck by an invisible truck, their electronics sparking and dying instantly. The mountain was no longer a tomb or a nursery. It was a battlefield. And Dr. Thorne realized that the Cryptic diary wasn't just a record, it was a lure. Kraus had known that one day, the curiosity of the modern world would lead them here, providing the very uplink the signal needed to infect the future. "The override," Thorne shouted to his specialist. "Forget the data. We have to pull the lever or this mountain becomes the epicenter of a global blackout." But as Thorne reached for the mercury override beneath the map table, a hand, cold as the glacier itself, grabbed his wrist. It was the Colonel, not a mummified body, but a holographic projection generated by the Eisen-Himmel alloy. The image of Friedrich Kraus stood before him, flickering with static, his eyes burning with a 1945 intensity. The lever does not put them to sleep, Doctor, the hologram whispered. It initiates the final detonation. Decide quickly. Do you save the world by destroying the evidence, or do you let the signal speak? The flickering hologram of Colonel Kraus stood like a ghost in the machine, his translucent hand still seemingly clamped around Dr. Thorne's wrist. The air in the chamber was now a swirling vortex of frost and ozone. Outside the vault door, the sound of heavy gunfire and the high-pitched whine of Overwatch energy weapons signaled that the mountain was being systematically purged. The final detonation? Thorne gasped, his eyes darting between the holographic colonel and the rusted lever beneath the map table. You mean this entire mountain is rigged? The mouth of ice was never meant to be captured, the hologram replied, its voice distorted by the electromagnetic interference. If the signal cannot reach the world in its entirety, the world must not have the technology at all. The mercury override will ignite the geothermal vents. The glacier will collapse, and the alloy will melt into the core of the mountain. No trace will remain. Behind Thorne, the first child had been joined by three others. They stood in a semicircle, their iridescent eyes fixed on the Overwatch soldiers who were trying to push through the breached doorway. The children weren't just fighting, they were protecting the upload. On the central console, a progress bar on Thorne's tablet hit 82%. The Shadow Ledger, a list of every dormant sleeper cell and hidden Nazi asset moved into the fabric of the modern world, was seconds away from being broadcast to every open server on Earth. Thorne, look at the data, the tech specialist yelled, pointing at a secondary monitor. The ledger, it's not just names. It's codes for satellite-controlled power grids. If this upload finishes, they can shut down the lights from Berlin to Washington with a single command. The Overwatch team leader, his red-lensed mask cracked from a previous blast, managed to roll into the chamber. He leveled a high-output laser rifle at the children, but his eyes were on Thorne. Step away from the lever, Doctor. That data is classified under a Tier 1 global security mandate. If you trigger that explosion, you're destroying the only evidence we have to track these cells. Thorne looked at the soldier, then at the iridescent-eyed young man who stood as a silent sentinel of a dead era. He realized the horrifying truth. Overwatch didn't want to stop the ledger. They wanted to own it. They wanted the codes for themselves to control the same power grids the children were targeting. You're not here to save the world, Thorne said, his voice cold. You're here to inherit the shadow. The hologram of Kraus flickered violently. 89%, the synthesized voice announced. Signal stability, optimal. The child of the signal turned his head toward Thorne. For the first time, a human emotion flickered in those milky eyes, fear. Not fear of death, but fear of the task he had been born for. He looked at the lever, then back at the Overwatch commander who was preparing to fire. Doctor, the young man whispered, his actual voice breaking through for the first time. We were told we were the heroes of the future, but all I see is more war. End it. End us. Thorne felt the weight of 80 years of silence pressing down on him. If he let the upload finish, a secret network would control the world's energy. If he let Overwatch take the ledger, a shadow government would do the same. The only way to win was to make sure no one won. He lunged for the lever. And oh, the Overwatch commander screamed, pulling the trigger of his laser rifle. The beam sliced through the air, hitting the map table and sending a shower of sparks over Thorne. But the momentum carried him forward. His hand gripped the cold, iron handle of the mercury override. With a scream of defiance, he threw his entire weight into the pull. A deep, guttural roar started in the bowels of the mountain. It wasn't an explosion of fire, but a sudden, violent release of pressurized steam. The ground buckled. The dark alloy on the walls began to liquefy, turning into a shimmering, toxic silver that flowed like water. "Get to the shaft," Thorn yelled to his team. As the ceiling began to rain massive blocks of ice and stone, the children of the signal didn't run. They sat back down on their bunks, closing their iridescent eyes as the liquid mercury alloy rose around them. They were returning to the silence. The last thing Thorn saw before the chamber was engulfed in a cloud of white steam was the hologram of Colonel Kraus. The ghost was smiling. He had finally completed his mission. He had ensured that his secrets would belong to no one. The mountain did not just collapse, it surrendered. As the mercury override took effect, the iron heaven alloy, the very fabric of the bunker, reached its critical melting point. The liquid metal didn't just heat up, it acted as a thermal conductor, drawing the volcanic heat from the mountain's core into the frozen chambers. The result was a catastrophic flash melt. Dr. Thorne and his two remaining team members scrambled through the primary access tunnel as the floor behind them turned into a river of molten silver. The Overwatch tactical team, caught between the collapsing ice and the liquid metal, vanished into the steam. There were no screams, only the roar of the mountain reclaiming its own. "The drone," the tech specialist yelled, pointing toward the mouth of ice. "If we can reach the exterior ledge, the drone's emergency transponder might guide a rescue team before the whole peak slides." They burst out of the cave entrance just as a massive section of the Grossglockner Glacier gave way. The ledge they stood on groaned, tilting toward the abyss. Below them, the valley was a sea of white mist, but above, the black helicopters of Overwatch were hovering like vultures. However, they weren't firing anymore. They were retreating. The electromagnetic pulse from the mercury override had fried their flight systems. They were barely staying airborne as they fled the rising heat. Thorn looked back one last time. The entrance to the mouth of ice was glowing with an intense, violet light. Then, with a sound like a thunderclap, the internal pressure blew. A pillar of steam and pulverized granite shot hundreds of feet into the air. The bunker, the technology, the children of the signal, and the cryptic diary were vaporized in a matter of seconds. Weeks later, the world's headlines were filled with reports of a freak geothermal event in the Alps. Geologists claimed that a hidden volcanic pocket had finally burst, causing the massive glacier slide. The official story was clean, scientific, and utterly false. Dr. Thorne sat in a quiet cafe in Zurich, his hands still scarred from the heat of the mountain. Across from him, the tech specialist opened a battered laptop. "I checked the global grid status, Eris. Everything is stable. The upload was cut off at 94%. Protocol 79 failed." "Did it?" Thorne asked, staring at a small, charred scrap of leather he had managed to shove into his pocket before the explosion. It was a fragment of the diary's cover. The colonel said the signal was a virus. Even at 94%, how much of the ledger made it into the cloud? The specialist's face went pale. He opened a private, encrypted browser and entered a specific coordinate he had memorized from the bunker's monitors. The screen didn't show a bank account or a military code. It showed a live feed of a satellite orbiting Earth. At the bottom of the screen, a small line of text was scrolling in a jagged, 1940s-style font. "The nursery is empty. The children are awake." Thorne realized the horrifying truth. The mercury override hadn't destroyed the signal. It had been the final part of the broadcast. The explosion provided the massive surge of energy needed to push the remaining 6% of the data into the global network. Kraus hadn't lied about the detonation. He just hadn't mentioned that the destruction of the mountain was the final enter key. Somewhere in the world, 5 men, or their descendants, had just received their final authentication codes. The shadow ledger was no longer in a frozen cave. It was in the pockets of the people walking the streets. As Thorne looked out at the peaceful Swiss morning, his phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. He answered, but there was no voice. Only a low-frequency hum, a sound that resonated in his teeth, exactly like the metal walls of the mouth of ice. The 80 years of silence hadn't ended. They had just become the background noise of the modern world.